Okay, I see people are starting to filter in. There's always that first moment of nervousness when attendees, you've gone live and attendees stay zero. So welcome to everyone who's joining us. I'm just going to give 1 minute just to allow people to filter in. And we are, okay, so just to welcome everybody to our latest Simon Talk. This is a series, I was just saying to the panel before, this is a series that we do monthly now. It kind of happened out of COVID and sort of was forced on us a little bit. But what we found is, in developing our thinking around it, that there's a really useful space to be had here around thinking about how we think about policy issues that we want to develop to the benefit of the service users of the Simon communities. But that means we're taking the information people like Karen in Northern Ireland, in Simon Northern Ireland Commission, and Anne-Marie and John do, and sort of apply it to our experience or our clients' experience of homelessness in efforts to move policy forward. But we think there's also a real value of highlighting the things that we find useful and saying to people, well, here, this should also be something you should consider. One, so you can better understand where Simon Communities of Ireland is coming from, but also to get that, if we think it's useful, hopefully other people will too. So this is what the series is all about. If you're attending and you're on social media, please do tweet or talk about us online using the hashtag Simon Talks. And as we go through, we won't interrupt the speakers. We'll let Anne-Marie and John speak through their to the research, and then Karen will come back in and give a bit of context for what's happening in Northern Ireland and how the importance of this research in the Northern Ireland context, and a little bit of background as well, kind of, I won't say responding to her research she has commissioned, but certainly putting in a context that I think is really useful for everybody. So what I would ask is, if you have any questions, do pop them into the chat or into the Q&A, and we'll get through as many as we can. And please do, whatever random thought comes in, do get it down, because I think it always makes a more lively interaction. It makes my job as chair much easier. So without further ado, I'll introduce Anne-Marie Gray and Dr. John Bells. Anne-Marie is Professor of Social Policy in the School of Applied Social and Political Sciences at Ulster University. She's also co-director of the ARC project. Her research interests are in the areas of social care, devolution and social policy, and gender and social policy. Publications include co-authored books published by Policy Press, Transforming Adult Social Care and Delivering Social Welfare, Governance and Service Provision in the UK in 2016. Dr. John Bell is Associate Lecturer and Researcher with the University of Ulster, with Ulster University, with more than 15 years of experience working on a variety of policy issues. He graduated from Queen's University Belfast with a BA in Modern History and Politics and an MA in Comparative Ethnic Conflict before joining the Institute for Conflict Research in 2005. John moved to Ulster University in 2013 and was awarded a PhD in 2017. Since then, he's worked as a lecturer and researcher with Ulster University and has worked on various research projects, including Communities in Transition program. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Anne-Marie and John, who are going to take us to their research with many, many thanks to them.
Thanks so much, Wayne. I'm just going to start sharing my screen here. Just give me a few seconds. So thank you, Wayne, and thanks, Simon Ireland, for the opportunity to talk to you and to share this research, which we appreciate because we do feel it is important research. The research was commissioned by Simon Northern Ireland, and I think it has, even since it's been completed, it has taken on even greater relevance in terms of the economic situation that we find ourselves in now across the island. So I'm going to start just by saying something about structure and the context for the research. Then my colleague John will present some of the key findings, and then I'll just pop back just to say something about the implications of the research for policy. So I think we all know that narratives on homelessness have created something of a stereotype. Very often people think about the rough sleeper, the people who are visibly homeless when they think about homelessness. And the hidden homelessness population, of course, has not been exposed because people in this situation are often living in some form of housing, but they react to their precarious situation in a way that their homelessness remains invisible. Some may not even see themselves as homelessness. And one thing that has stuck in my mind is that during one of the workshops, which were facilitated by us at the very start of the research by a youth organisation, there was a young peer worker who had said that she had just realised that she herself for some time had been in a hidden homelessness situation. She talked about living in a very challenging family environment where she only went home for the absolute minimum amount of time, and where she never felt safe. And she actually, I think, summed it up really well, because she said for all of that time, she had a roof over her head, but she didn't have a home. So this is the first study of hidden homelessness in Northern Ireland, and it was funded by Nationwide. We'd like to acknowledge and thank them for that. So the underpinning research questions are these. We were keen to look at how hidden homelessness is defined, how it's measured, some of the limitations and issues around that. We wanted to see what were the factors that increased vulnerability to hidden homelessness. Who were the individuals or the groups who are most likely to experience it, and why? And then what about the main impacts on those who do experience hidden homelessness? How long do they remain in the situation, and how that impacts on their circumstances, on their future well-being, education of children, and so on as well. And then we looked at the challenges to seeking and to receiving support. And then finally, of course, we considered the implications for policy and for practice. Now, the research in the end was conducted during the pandemic, and that was a very specific context. But even that challenging context, I think, has been superseded by the current cost of living crisis that we find ourselves in. And I think that's why we particularly appreciate the opportunity to bring this research, to life again, because I think we do have to think about these findings now in that context. So with that, I am going to pass over to John, who is going to start presenting the findings and the methodology.
Thanks very much, Anne-Marie. I'm just hoping, can people hear me? As long as people can hear me, okay. I'm technologically not very good. Thank you for the invite, Simon. It's lovely to be here today. I said before we started, sometimes when you're a researcher, you're involved in research projects and you never know what happens to the findings. So it's really nice to see the Simon community actually trying to have an impact in terms of policy with this research. As Anne-Marie has touched upon, we were commissioned just before COVID by the Simon community to conduct this piece of research. And we actually started the research literally in February 2020, so literally just before COVID had hit. So that impacted upon the methodology that we had planned, and then ultimately the methodology that we adopted. I suppose there were four real strands to what we did in this research. So the first strand really was a detailed literature review of the academic work and the policy work on homelessness, but particularly hidden homelessness in other international contexts, which really kicked us off and gave us a grounding in the topic area. The really important piece of research was obviously the engagement with people who had been through hidden homelessness, and also with staff who worked in the sector. So we interviewed 5 people who had been through hidden homelessness, and the ethics of that were that we actually, working closely with support staff in the sector, we spoke with 5 people who had come out the other side of hidden homelessness. So we didn't speak to anyone who was in the midst of experiencing hidden homelessness for obvious reasons. We had planned to speak to more people who had been experiencing or had experienced hidden homelessness. Because of COVID and the ethics around that, and not being able to do face-to-face interviews, and everything was moved on to Zoom. In agreement with the Simon community, we realised that perhaps wasn't necessarily the most appropriate way to proceed. So what we did was we increased our number of interviews with members of staff in the homelessness sector. So alongside the 5 case studies with people who had been through hidden homelessness, we spoke with 45 members of staff of various organisations, community voluntary, and statutory who worked in the field of homelessness and homelessness prevention. And we also want a huge thank you to Youth Action, and particularly Martin McMullen from Youth Action. We also held 3 facilitated workshops that were facilitated by Youth Action in Belfast, Derry and Newry with 35 youth workers. And we tried to get a bit of a regional and geographic spread again. And because the literature review highlighted to us that young people in particular, particularly under 25s, were particularly vulnerable to hidden homelessness, and one manifestation of it in particular, sofa surfing. Actually speaking with youth workers about their experience of the young people they work with was really, really important. So just moving on, I suppose, to some of the definitions and some of the measurements of hidden homelessness. I mean, one thing to say at the outset, I suppose, is that there's no single definition of any form of homelessness at all. And that's also the case for hidden homelessness. And whenever we were looking at the literature, there was a challenge with regards to definition, and that also then impacted, because there was no single definition, that impacted upon data collection, which is shown by this slide. So really, in terms of numbers, we genuinely don't know how many people are living in conditions of hidden homelessness. Okay, and I'll start maybe with the definitions and then work towards the statistics. So the difference in definitions in the Northern Ireland context are highlighted by the 2 definitions on the screen. So the first definition here is from the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. So they refer to hidden homelessness, including households that may be staying with friends or sharing with family because they've no accommodation of their own. And those households may be unknown to the Housing Executive. And that's one of the key elements of someone being defined as hidden homeless, that statutory agencies aren't aware of them or they're not presenting to a statutory homeless. And then the second definition there is from the Northern Ireland Budget Office. And it says hidden homelessness refers to people who can be considered homeless but are not visible on the streets or in official statistics. For example, households staying with friends or sharing with family members or squatting. So you can see immediately that those 2 definitions, they're generally similar, but they're slightly different. So the second definition there includes squatting as part of hidden homelessness. The first definition doesn't. It just refers to sharing or staying with family. So that became very clear during the research that there was no single definition, even amongst policy statutory providers in Northern Ireland, which is obviously problematic when we're trying to estimate and measure the phenomenon as well. So moving on from the difficulties in terms of definition, in terms of, sorry, Anne-Marie, if we could maybe just skip back just the previous slide in terms of before we move on. In terms of the numbers, so there are 2 estimates really, and they are really estimates of how many people are living in conditions of hidden homelessness in Northern Ireland. So the first is from Nicholas Police and Joanne Bretherton, and a piece of research they did in 2013, and they used application data from people presenting to the Northern Ireland Housing Executive as statutory homeless. And they also looked at some census data, and they estimated then, almost 10 years ago, that there were around 11,000 households who may be classed as hidden homeless. And the second set of figures there between 70,000 and 112,000. That comes from work that was conducted by Professor Suzanne Fitzpatrick and her research team as part of the Homelessness Monitoring series of reports in 2020. And Suzanne Fitzpatrick and her team basically looked at census data. And there's a slight difference again in methodology. So the second definition are between 70,000 and 112,000 people. That's referring to people living in concealed households. So that would include, for example, dependent children who are maybe in the family home but would like to live out on their own. So again, there's a difference in methodology there. So we don't know what the numbers are, but what we do know is that the statutory statistics on homelessness are a gross underestimation of the real figure. So in terms of the definitions, we really looked at the definitions to see which one would be most appropriate and match, I suppose, the experiences of people that we'd spoken to, staff in the sector, and also with the wider literature. And Suzanne Fitzpatrick and her team's definition of hidden homelessness in the Homelessness Monitor report is certainly the most comprehensive because it covers different elements that might be considered to be hidden homelessness. So if you look at it there on the slide, they give the examples of people living in overcrowded conditions, squatters. They talk about sofa surfing around friends and relatives. But the key for us to this definition, and why, and we'll come to this at the end, why we recommended that there was a single definition agreed between statutory and community and voluntary sector in Northern Ireland around hidden homelessness, and we suggested this one was because of the use of the phrase involuntarily sharing. And that's really, really important. The two previous definitions on the previous slide talk about hidden homelessness as if people are just sharing with family and friends. And the word sharing implies equality. It's quite a nice word, really, when you share something with someone. There's quite positive connotations to it. In the research that we conducted and looking at the wider international work, obviously most people who are in hidden homelessness, sofa surfing, wherever, they're staying in overcrowded conditions with others. They don't really want to be doing that. They're doing that because they've no other option. So this phrase, involuntarily sharing, for us far better captured that feeling that people have when they're in that situation, which other definitions didn't. So just moving on to a bit of background, actually, and I know, so our study was specifically on those forms of hidden homelessness, particularly in terms of overcrowding, particularly in terms of people who aren't in the statutory sector, particularly in terms of sofa surfing and people staying with family and friends. But before I get to the main findings on that, it's probably important just to say something around statutory homelessness in Northern Ireland, because it's highly likely that a number of people that end up hidden homeless and sofa surfing perhaps with others have either not presented to the statutory system, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, or have presented as statutory homeless and been rejected, and then ended up falling through the system and become part of the hidden homeless. So in Northern Ireland, we have the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, which is essentially a quango who have statutory duty to house people who present as homeless. So we have the 4-stage test up here, really focuses around these 4 things. So eligibility, priority need, homelessness and intentionality. Eligibility essentially is the right to reside, essentially to be here in the first place. Priority need refers to people who are perhaps pregnant or with dependent children, who have an underlying vulnerability, particularly in relation to mental health, or who are at risk of violence, particularly in terms of domestic violence. The third one, homelessness, basically refers to your need. So the person's need to demonstrate that they are actually homeless or can become homeless in the next 28 days. And the last one, intentionality, is basically where someone has to say that they didn't make themselves intentionally homeless, or they haven't been asked to leave somewhere because of their behaviour, antisocial behaviour and things like that. Now, what came out of the research, and I'll get to that shortly, well, this isn't unproblematic, this 4-stage test. There were real issues around this, and particularly people said to us, it's almost that sense of the burden of proof of proving you're homeless lies with a person who's already in a particularly vulnerable state, and to go through this quite complex process. And 2 of those, and I'll come to this shortly, two of those criteria were particularly criticised, one of them being priority need, and the second one being intentionality. Now, in Scotland, priority need was done away with in 2012, because what they found there was that this sense about priority need was actually blocking the system for younger single people, particularly people under 25 who didn't have children and perhaps couldn't prove a mental or physical vulnerability. And they were either then not presenting to the system because they felt they had no chance of getting a home, or they were presenting to the system and being rejected. So actually Scotland rescinded priority need almost 10 years ago. And the statistics and the evidence would suggest that more younger people were then presenting as statutory homeless. So Suzanne Fitzpatrick will talk about this quite a lot, and says that's been quite effective as a policy shift to encourage younger people who may fall through the cracks to be rehoused and rehomed. One of the challenges, again, which is raised with that, is that Scotland has a larger housing stock than we do. We have real pressure on housing stock in Northern Ireland. So it's perhaps not as simple as to say, well, it's worked in Scotland, let's do it in Northern Ireland, but it's certainly something that should and could be given consideration. The other point there, just before we move on to the next slide, is at the bottom in terms of the 2017 Across the Water, the Homelessness Reduction Act was introduced, which really strengthened sort of the prevention and relief statutory duties on local authorities across the water. We're different in the sense that we have the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. We have the statutory duty for housing across the water as local authorities. And that piece of legislation really doubled the time frame within which people can present as they're going to become homeless within 56 days. In Northern Ireland, it's still 28 days. So we're at half the time frame as they are across the water. So again, people said to us throughout the research that that had a real impact, because it wasn't necessarily providing people with the time to be found a home before they're made homeless. And I'll come back to that towards the end. Again, just before we get into the sort of main findings with regards to hidden homelessness, in terms of the statutory homeless statistics, these are the main reasons in Northern Ireland why people are presenting to the Northern Ireland Housing Executive as homeless. So the top one there is accommodation not reasonable, which in a UK context is fairly unique. And accommodation not reasonable typically is where perhaps an older person is maybe in the family home. Perhaps their spouse has passed away or children are no longer at home, and they're in physical ill health perhaps, or there's a disability, and they maybe can't, for example, get upstairs. That would be accommodation, generally speaking, accommodation not reasonable. And then obviously we have sharing breakdown, family dispute is the next one, and then loss of private rented accommodation, which I know from reading some academic work from Maynooth is absolutely huge in the Republic of Ireland. Maybe be interesting to hear more about that in the conversation afterwards. One of the criticisms against Suzanne Fitzpatrick would have of the system in Northern Ireland, the way it's structured, is accommodation not reasonable. The argument would be it's more symptomatic of housing need rather than homelessness per se. And I'll come to that again on the next slide. But fairly recent statistics between January and December 2021 found that about 64% of homeless presenters to the Housing Executive were accepted full duty applicant, so they were accepted homeless status. So we'll just move on to the next slide, Anne-Marie. Thanks. Sorry, we go back one. They look very similar, but they're slightly different. Thanks. Okay, in terms of main reasons for being accepted statutory homeless in Northern Ireland with the Housing Executive, it's in the same order as before. Accommodation not reasonable is the main reason. But just looking beyond this towards the bottom of the slide, the previous data indicates, and this is data from I think 2019, 2020, that younger single presenters who can't demonstrate priority need, who maybe don't have children, are much more likely statistically to be turned down for support. Older applicants who are perhaps over 70 are much more likely to be accepted due to perceived vulnerability to do with age, ill health and disability. And those people would make up the vast majority of accommodation not reasonable decisions. So that, as it was told to us within the research, was a huge issue with regards to making younger single people, particularly 25 and under, far more likely to be rejected by the statutory homeless system and far more likely to self-serve or become part of a hidden homeless cohort. The other thing at the bottom there is probably worth saying something about is in terms of there are also regional variations up here. I'm sure it's the same down south in terms of statutory allocations of housing, and also depends on housing stock. So I think in particularly parts of North Belfast and West Belfast, there'd be a lot of pressure, a lot of people on the waiting list for social housing. Whereas I think FDA acceptance rates there were around 63, 64%. Whereas if you look at the likes of Antrim and Newton Abbey, different council area, rates were about 77, 78%. So they're much higher, again, because there's more housing stock. But that's, again, we'll return to that point towards the end. So just moving on. Into some of our findings. So Anne-Marie touched on this at the start. One of the challenges that people said to us throughout the research was really that almost the stereotype of homelessness as rough sleeping, street homelessness, as the visible manifestation of homelessness. And a lot of people would have said to us, even people who had been through hidden homelessness, who had maybe, we spoke to again, and everyone has pseudonyms, Roger, who ended up was a victim of domestic violence and abuse from his wife, psychological and physical, and he slept in a mattress in the back of his work van. But because Roger had a family home, which his wife didn't really let him into, except for occasionally to sleep, he didn't see himself as homeless, because for him, homelessness was people on the street. So because he had some form of roof over his head, albeit it was generally the roof of his van, he didn't see himself for a long time as hidden homeless or homeless at all. So there was this real challenge in terms of actually educating people as to what homelessness is, and it's more than simply rough sleeping. So that was a real issue. We did have people, particularly support workers who worked in the sector, talk about people being homeless if they have a roof over their head, and it is to do with, say, disability, and they can't get up the stairs to the bedroom or to use a bathroom, and they would have said, well, look, those people should be considered homeless. The counterpoint to that is, again, is this to do with housing need as opposed to people who literally have nowhere, who won't have a roof over their head? And I think that's a discussion that needs to be had, and it's something we'll return to in the recommendations. I mean, as you can see from the quotations there, I mean, a key theme coming out, won't surprise anyone, was that homelessness generally, and hidden homelessness as well as part of that, was just so much more than a housing issue. It's so much more than bricks and mortar. It's about all of the wraparound support and services that need to be there for people, particularly people with mental health vulnerability issues, addiction issues, who need that support perhaps to maintain a tenancy, who've maybe never had a tenancy, particularly maybe young people who are coming out from the care system. And I know Simon do some fantastic work, you know, with young people, sort of that 16, 17 cohort before they turn 18, and essentially they're going to be made homeless, to actually try and set up provisions around them, a support structure where they can actually move into a tenancy and maintain that and not fall into some form of homelessness. So those were some really interesting points that came out of the discussions. In terms of vulnerability to hidden homelessness, there's a report by the Northern Ireland Audit Office in 2017, and the report has a quote in it which basically says, it's the rather trite comment that any of us can fall victim to homelessness at any point. And there's truth in that, absolutely. It can happen to anyone. And I mean, on our 5 case studies were drawn from, I mean, we people in their 20s, we had Roger was in his mid-70s, we had male, we had female, we had different regions of experience. We had people who'd come out of prison who then found it very difficult to get a job due to their criminal record and ended up sofa surfing. We had Amy, who was through the care system when she was younger, victim of domestic violence. We had Roger, victim of domestic violence. So we did have evidence of people coming from sort of different demographic backgrounds. Having said that, when you look at the statistics in the wider literature, and even in our discussions with our interviewees, the particular cohorts of people who are far, far more likely and far, far more vulnerable to becoming homeless and becoming hidden homeless than others. So some of the most vulnerable cohorts to becoming hidden homeless include care leavers, people leaving prison, LGBTQI+, particularly as was told to us in rural communities, where maybe someone comes out at a fairly young age and there's friction then in the home and the family can't accept that, and the young person is asked or forced to leave. And we found that was an issue, particularly for some young men in some rural communities in Northern Ireland, sadly. Also mental health and addiction. So people who have maybe overlapping vulnerabilities with regards to addiction, also more likely to fall into hidden homelessness. Poverty also, and Anne-Marie's mentioned the cost of living crisis. Before that, obviously, we had COVID, and before that, we had austerity and all of those things, which we'll return to at the end. So even levels of economic activity and poverty, hugely challenging. Victims of domestic violence, I mentioned Roger and Margaret, two of the people that we spoke to, who thankfully are out the other side of that, but who had experienced domestic violence, and that was really impacted upon their lives, obviously. I've mentioned so far young people being particularly, young single people, particularly vulnerable to becoming hidden homeless, particularly under 25s, because they can't demonstrate that priority need in the statutory system. They're quite often rejected. But also people who are over 55 and potentially who have become single, where there's been relationship breakdown. And again, as we saw earlier, relationship breakdown, family breakdown is one of the most common reasons why people present in Northern Ireland as statutory homeless. And particularly there, we were told that was particularly affecting women over the age of 55, where maybe a relationship had broken down and they'd been asked to, or for their own safety, left the family home. And there were difficulties there also around intentionality then, if they went to go to present to the housing executive, again, if they've left the home voluntarily, but if there's been abuse or an abusive relationship in the background, again, it's just, you have to prove that in a sense, so people found that quite difficult. Also asylum seekers, we have a very vulnerable cohort to hidden homelessness, and also people who in Northern Ireland were under paramilitary threat. In one of our case studies, we spoke to a young woman in her 30s called Michelle, whose family had been forced literally at gunpoint out of their home in North Belfast. and had to leave. And Michelle essentially lived in a hotel for over a year. And Michelle was slightly different from some of our other case studies, in the sense that Michelle managed to, I don't know how she did it, managed to hold down a fairly good job, and no one that she worked with knew. And it was the fear and the shame and the stigma of being homeless and what had happened, sadly. And she wouldn't tell anyone until after about a year. She confided in a friend, and the friend helped her get support. And again, thankfully, she's out the other side. But paramilitary threat in the Northern Ireland context, again, was another issue which was significant and increasing vulnerability. Just moving on then in terms of the impact. I mean, some of the obvious ones in terms of people reporting to us that they just felt a total lack of self-worth. Their self-confidence just absolutely dipped to zero. And this sense, and there's a term that's used in the literature which really reflected what people said to us. It's called permanent impermanence. So this sort of psychological insecurity of particularly when you're hidden homeless and you're maybe staying with someone else, or like Roger was sleeping in the back of his van, of never knowing what's going to happen tomorrow. Never known so there was no divide between public and private. There was very difficult to have a normal routine, if you like. I mean, even people who are staying with others, friends or family, or friends of friends, they may have to get up in the morning whenever their host gets up. They may have to go to bed in the evening whenever their host gets up. There were other instances where, if the host was having a drink, and fancied company, they insisted on the person staying with them also doing likewise, and then the person that's staying with them who's homeless feels obliged, because they have a roof over their head, to maybe do things that they don't want to. And there's also risk of sexual and financial exploitation and all of those issues. So just the real physical and psychological impact of not having a place of your own and never knowing what the next day will bring, really. And there's the British sociologist Anthony Giddens talks about that. He talks about the security that as human beings we all have in our day and daily routine. And we pretty much like our little routine, and we know when we're going to work and when we're coming home, and generally speaking, when we're going to bed. And there's a divide between our public selves and our private selves. And for people who are hidden homeless and who don't have a home of their own, they don't have that. So the impact that has on their mental health, their loneliness, their self-confidence, their self-esteem, the impact it has if they have children. And I know Rory Hearn's done some really, really good work, drawing out some of the impacts of particularly in the Republic of Ireland, on children as well, who are living as part of the hidden homeless cohort, who may be staying with friends and family in overcrowded conditions, which is really problematic. So there's lots of issues there. Pieces of research across the water, again, sort of corroborated what people told us in our findings. So it's a large-scale study in 2016 by Clark, who surveyed 2,000, I think it was 16 to 24-year-olds, basically around their experiences of homelessness generally, rough sleeping, particularly of hidden homelessness. And some of the statistics were pretty shocking in terms of those quite high numbers who had actually been rough sleeping. I think it was about 15%. But about 30% or so had actually, of a couple of thousand young people at university, had actually experienced some form of sofa surfing. Now, that may have only been for a few nights out with friends while they were finding somewhere else to stay. But the levels actually that were reported in that study were quite high. And again, that highlighted the impact of the damage to psychological health, mental health, the damage even that has to physical health, the difficulty in maintaining a job when you don't have your own home, the difficulty in even looking or applying for a job. So the financial precarity that someone's in can be really, really difficult to get out of. And what some of the wider international research has shown was that hidden homelessness, particularly in terms of sofa surfing, can either be a gateway into other more serious, if you like, forms of homelessness in terms of chronic homelessness or in terms of rough sleeping, or it can almost act as a relief for people coming out of that. So for people who have maybe been on the street, they might sofa surf with a peer or someone they met for a couple of days, crash at their house. So there are issues to do with that, as well as it being a gateway in or out. So we move on just to the next slide. And these are just some comments with regards to what people were telling us with regards to hidden homelessness. So again, focus on issues to do with young people under 18 as well, and the difficulty in securing support for young people. As I said, Simon Community have some really good work that's ongoing at the minute, that's working with young people in the care setting, that's trying to ensure that the processes are in place for them when they turn 18. But they can be a particularly vulnerable cohort as well. And again, the bottom quote refers to, LGBTQI+, again, seemingly a really huge issue with regards to probably their overrepresentation in the hidden homeless demographic, again, because of maybe staying at home, and seem to be particularly the father figure, or in some instances stepfather, then ask them to leave the family home. So some really sad instances that were talked about with us. Just skip on there, sorry, Emily. So I mean, I've mentioned our case studies essentially with regards to, when you spoke to people that have been through it, and thankfully they were at the other side, but I mean, Michelle, as I said, staying in a hotel, Roger in a mattress in the back of his work van, Amy had experienced domestic violence, had been in care, she was in and out of bed at breakfasts. Not only did she experience domestic violence when she was younger, she then experienced domestic violence whenever she was older as well, and in terms of relationship. And all the people we spoke to just talked about the fear, the anxiety, the shame, the worthlessness. And if we just skip on, sorry, to the next one. This is the last slide for me before I hand back to Anne-Marie. And some of the barriers with regards to seeking support, lack of funding for service providers. So that was talked about at length. There was a real issue with regards to that in terms of actually having the budgets and resources in place to retain staff within the sector. It was acknowledged there was high turnover of staff within the homelessness sector. The second one I've talked about, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, particularly the capacity, but the challenges is particularly around intentionality and particularly around priority need. Now, there was some positive feedback reported to us with regards to the move in 2018, I think, towards a bit of a more preventative focus with what's called housing solutions, where someone has a caseworker who helps them work through single point of contact, and the Simon community have been heavily involved in that. So there was some discussion of some good practice, but the limitations of the housing executive and the statutory system were key. Lack of availability of suitable housing up here is huge. I think we've about 40,000 people on the social housing waiting list. Ballpark figure, around 30,000 people or so in housing stress. So we don't have the housing stock to meet the need. So that's a huge issue. Private sector rent, again, was huge in terms of affordability, particularly in the current cost of living crisis. Also, where landlords could literally just sell the house, obviously, without last minute notice, and people then were scrambling around trying to find somewhere to live. So again, that's a huge issue, and I know that's a massive issue, particularly in Dublin. Criminal record, again, was a problem. That was certainly one for Robert, who was one of our case studies when he was trying to apply for housing. And Robert also then would have had complex needs around that with regards to addiction and mental health and vulnerability, which was a barrier then to him seeking support. And there's a waiting list as well here. I think about 1,200 people who are seeking to use addiction services, again, which doesn't help. I've talked a bit about the stigma around being seen as homeless or hidden homeless. And again, people may be feeling if they have, well, I have a roof over my head. Okay, it's not my house. I'm staying with my sister or a friend, but I'm not homeless. Homeless is someone who lives on the street. So again, it's about education and trying to challenge those stereotypes. And also, again, just the difficulties in maintaining employment, particularly for people for some of those complex needs and vulnerabilities around mental health and addiction, and even basic budgeting skills, which is why some of the work that Simon are involved in is really important in tenancy, maintaining tenancies for people. Anne-Marie, back to you, I think.
Yes. Thanks very much, John. Thank you. So I'm just going to briefly just say something about the policy context in Northern Ireland, and and I think what's important for us, or what we found to be very important, was that this should be looked at as not just a homelessness issue, and in fact not just a housing issue, but a social policy issue more generally. Now, of course, as in Ireland and in the nations of the UK, changes to housing tenure in Northern Ireland in recent decades have been very profound. And in particular for us, that quite substantive decline in Northern Ireland housing executive tenure and the growth in private sector rental tenure. And that's really impacted very disproportionately on some of the most vulnerable population groups. And I think there is absolutely no doubt that that has contributed to hidden homelessness. And of course, we are seeing now not just rents going up in the private sector, but an escalation in people being asked to leave private rental accommodation as landlords have been keen to sell in the current market. So there the problem has, to a degree, been acknowledged. So we've had an expert evidence review completed for a new, apparently a forthcoming anti-poverty strategy, which has been much delayed because of the suspension of the institutions, obviously. But that anti-poverty evidence review was very, very clear that housing is one of the most fundamental cross-cutting issues for any future anti-poverty strategy. And it really drew attention to the vulnerability and precarity of low-income households in the private rented sector. And as John said, that was a point made by so many of the participants in our research and in other research in Northern Ireland on poverty as well. And I think one of the things that is worth mentioning too is that we, time and time again, we heard from workers in the sector and from those 3 focus groups that were facilitated that people hold out in quite difficult housing situations for a public sector house. So they'll stay in hostels, they'll stay in hotels, you know, they'll stay in not good accommodation before they will go into the private sector, because they see a housing executive house as more secure, you know, less chance of eviction and so on. In Northern Ireland, of course, we have had really persistent challenges with regard to poverty. John has mentioned economic inactivity. It's certainly the highest rate of economic inactivity in the UK. And that's related to a number of things, but those things include major deficiencies in social infrastructure. So we don't have a childcare strategy. We have a very persistent problem of low pay. You know, the most recent data has shown that households in Northern Ireland have now the least disposable income in the UK. So all of these issues cause and exacerbate the problem of hidden homelessness. And during COVID, the UK government at Westminster did implement a £20 uplift for universal credit, which is social security benefits, but that has now been removed, and the data shows that that has had an impact as well. These are the most recent figures for rental costs, really, and they're a bit out of date now because they're from the last quarter of 2021. But even then, we were seeing, you know, a rate of increase which is really not sustainable for people on the incomes that they're on. And what's quite interesting is the rate across Northern Ireland is, you can see, is 6.9%, but actually the rate outside of Belfast is greater. And the new figures for this will be due out shortly, and I think they will, you know, present even further cause for concern. So a major cause of housing insecurity for us is this shortfall between what's called in the benefit system local housing allowance and actual rents. So the housing benefit is based on the bottom 30% of rents. But the housing executive's own figures show that less than 10% of rented properties are in that bottom 30%. And you can see from the table here that the majority of people, well, 25.9% who are renting rent in the 500 to 599 pounds category, but almost the same number are paying between 600 and 700 pounds for their rent. So what's happening is that private rented sectors are having to make up the rest of their rent from their disposable, from a diminishing disposable income. So in terms of what was happening in terms of policy before the Assembly was brought down, in 2021, the Department for Communities and the Housing Executive published a number of strategies on or related to homelessness, and they included a draft homelessness strategy, an action plan for temporary accommodation, and a consultation really on housing supply. Now, that's all very laudable, and they were all very welcome, but there's really fundamental issues regarding housing supply, and I think particularly that paper lacked specific detail about how this issue was going to be addressed. And to the extent that it was actually, in doing a response, very, very difficult to comment on the adequacy of some of those proposed measures. So just as one example of that, there was absolutely no reference at all to protecting the stock of increasingly scarce public sector houses by ending the mandatory sale of housing executive houses under the right to buy. So the right to buy was introduced in the 1980s by Margaret Thatcher. Other devolved administrations, so in Scotland and Wales, they have rescinded that. But Northern Ireland, whilst they've done that for housing association houses, have not committed to doing that for public sector houses. So in the research, we do make a number of recommendations. And John, I think, has covered most of the issues very well, and these link back to those issues. We do think that there needs to be some thought given to an agreed definition and a better way of measuring hidden homelessness. I think core to what we're saying is this need for a rebalancing of housing provision, a much stronger focus on publicly owned housing. What's said in the draft housing supply strategy is to be welcomed, but there needs to be an absolute commitment to ending the mandatory sale of housing executive properties, and that would only bring us into line with other devolved jurisdictions. There has been some movement in protecting the rights of vulnerable tenants, but they absolutely don't go far enough. And that housing precarity, as we've seen, even since we published the research, has become more of a problem. And both poverty research and housing research has shown that it is the low-income households in the private rented sector who are also the most likely to live in poor quality housing. So John has talked about the statutory duties and the need to strengthen those with regard to prevention and relief along the lines of the 27 Homelessness Reduction Act in England. We do also agree with the review of the implementation of priority need. And I think we need to look very carefully at the demographic cohorts which fall down on that element of the homelessness test. And particularly those young people who are also marginalised in other ways. So recent work we have done on drugs use and drug support services during the pandemic, showing that as well, that people with these complex needs pushed further and further to the margins, including the housing margins. And then one of the things we've talked about is the implementation of a bond scheme, which would help support people in private rented sector with access to small grants to cover deposits. Now, the Simon community already has a very successful tenancy sustainment programme, which shows good results. So 98% of tenants who benefit from that have remained in their own homes beyond 6 months. And there are other examples. But the challenge is, of course, around funding, and it's around embedding and sustaining those initiatives. So we know something of what works, but it's very difficult then to plan in the long term. So I think around that, we do need to be looking at longitudinal research, better ways of measuring and assessing, the long-term impacts of initiatives, but to do that with more sustainable funding over a much longer period of time. There is a need for awareness raising. We do know that there are people who are in a hidden homelessness situation who don't recognise themselves, but also the agencies that work with people. So this was particularly the case for the youth sector, that they said they weren't always good at recognising hidden homelessness because it wasn't something that has been talked about to a great extent. So we do intend to use the research to work with some of those organisations just to support those workers so that they can be signposting young people to the right provision and so on. So at that point, I am going to stop sharing the screen because I think we might have exceeded our time by a little bit.
Thanks, Karen. Sorry, thanks, Anne-Marie. Yeah, you did, but it was all really good and interesting stuff. So you're more than forgiven for taking the extra minute or two. But I am going to hand over straight away to Karen McAlister, and we will try and get some of those. I see some questions coming in already, which I think are really good. We're going to try and get to those as well. But I'm going to hand over to Karen now, who joined from the Simon community in Northern Ireland. She joined Simon community in 2015. She's a qualified social worker with over 20 years experience working in the voluntary sector. And in 2021, she took up the role of Head of Research and Development for the charity. Prior to that, Karen oversaw youth and family provision at the charity, ensuring the dynamic and innovative services were developed and delivered to the most vulnerable clients of the assignment. So with that, I'm going to hand over directly to you, Karen.
Thanks so much, Wayne, and thank you very much for a really kind invitation to talk to you today. And I hope this is just the beginning of many conversations and much shared learning. I think Simon Community Northern Ireland are really keen about that. I'm really keen to get to questions and have a conversation with you, so I'm not going to talk for too long. Just a couple of points, because I think my colleagues Anne-Marie and John have kind of really given a detailed overview of the position. But where we got to, I mean, I'm sure like yourselves, as Anne-Marie has said, there was no research in Northern Ireland in relation to hidden homelessness. It was a significant issue. We as a charity were seeing it as a significant issue, but it was invisible. It was outside of statistics or official statistics, and our evidence base was anecdotal. So for us, we were committed to actually changing this, both in relation to trying to understand the impact, the number, but also to gain the lived experience of people in those circumstances for us to both improve the service delivery that we offer, but also for us to actually have a mandate to advocate for social change. And that's why we were able to secure the funding to work alongside the University of Ulster. I mean, we now have a clearer picture in relation to the context and impact of homelessness in Northern Ireland. But this is set now against a very challenging housing and homelessness landscape. And I'm sure you are also facing that in the south. I mean, as John has highlighted, you know, we have 44,000 people on social housing waiting lists. This is the largest number since records began in 2002, 13% increase on last year, 30,000 in housing stress, 9% increase on the previous year, continued reduction in social housing allocations. Again, it's the lowest since 2002. Our temporary accommodation was absolutely decimated during COVID. Between 1920 and 2021, there was 115% increase in temporary accommodation. So we're seeing a massive increase in the use of bed and breakfast, hotels, single lets. We're seeing now an increase in street homeless. And young people were the population that were most impacted during COVID in relation to requiring temporary accommodation. For us as a charity, for every one bed, I mean, we are operating at full occupancy. For every one bed that becomes available across our 20 accommodation projects, we have 10 people waiting for it. So we are in a significant crisis. Anne-Marie has touched on issues around poverty, and we know homelessness is about multiple social disadvantage. She's touched on issues in relation to addiction, but one of the other significantly concerning issues in Northern Ireland is mental health. And as a population across Northern Ireland, we experience the worst mental health in the UK. So we have 1 in 5 adults experiencing a mental health disorder at any one time. We have psychiatric morbidity at 25% higher in Northern Ireland than anywhere else in the UK. Our population of children and young people are reported to have 25% higher rates of anxiety and depression than anywhere else in the UK. So, and obviously there's lots of reasons behind this, but social and economic factors, poverty, and also our legacy of the Troubles. So this is within our general population. So if we look at that, and we're doing another piece of research on that, but if we look at that, we are seeing increased issues in relation to mental health within our homelessness population. So that's another kind of factor that is out there in relation to what we're dealing with as a provider on a daily basis. And I think what Anne-Marie has shown, I mean, the research has been fantastic. It has given us an evidence base. We have a clear kind of recommendations and policy recommendations to take forward. We did get buy-in in relation to our statutory partners and a commitment in relation to actually looking at this issue more. Anne-Marie has touched on the many strategies that came out in 2021 and have since come into action. And whilst Anne-Marie has highlighted some of the challenges in that, and we absolutely support that, it was a step in the right direction. Yeah, but what has happened subsequently in Northern Ireland is that we've had a range of strategies, we've had an election, and now we have no assembly. So actually we're in a state of freeze. We can't do anything. So we have strategies that look at homelessness prevention, look at housing first, look at housing supply. But actually, because we have no assembly, we have no government, we're frozen. At the minute in Northern Ireland, we're operating on quarterly budgets, so every quarter. So we're probably in the most challenging position that we've been in relation to homelessness and housing. And, you know, without an assembly, the kind of progressing and moving out of this kind of crisis is exceptionally challenging. So I'm going to stop there on a really maybe not so positive point, but it's actually, I wanted to be really clear about the reality of what is happening in Northern Ireland. And I'm sure it's very similar to the realities that you're experiencing as well. But Wayne, maybe I'll stop chatting and let people maybe come back to you there.
Thanks, Karen. That's really useful. It's really useful to get that context. I mean, one of the things that did strike me as John and Anne-Marie were speaking, and the additional comments there, is how much similarity there is in the experiences. And also, I was really struck by how similar the experiences of hidden homelessness, when people articulated their experiences and the stresses of it. It resonated very significantly with my time in frontline services, what people would have spoken to me about as their experiences of homelessness. So that experiential aspect to it is the crossover is really striking. There are a number of striking aspects, but I want to get to the questions. I'm actually going to take the questions in reverse, not in the order, because it's top and tailed by Kenneth. And I think the last two questions come to possible solutions. So Kenneth raises, could the adoption of ethos, which is the European typology of homelessness developed in Europe by Fianza, could its adoption by statutory bodies provide an impetus and useful framework for more active monitoring and measuring of hidden homelessness? If people would like to consider that. And Peter asks, given that agreement from planning agreed to build is approximately 3 years, are compulsory purchase schemes from government an option? Is that something we should be looking at? I can give the Simon Communities Environment position on that, but I suppose Karen is the first port of call with those questions. What do you think?
I mean, again, I think they're what we're looking at in Northern Ireland. I know the Housing Executive are very keen to look at a range of options to increase housing supply. So obviously the housing supply strategy issued by the Department of Communities gave a commitment to building 100,000 houses. And also the Housing Executive are looking at various mechanisms by which to secure housing. The legislation in Northern Ireland is different, and they're trying to navigate how they're going to do that. We're also looking at other organisations buying houses. So for example, I know some Simon communities in the south are doing it as well, but Simon community in Northern Ireland are also buying houses in relation to our Creating Homes project. So there's a range of different mechanisms by which we're trying to bring houses back into the sector to support people who are experiencing homelessness or who are experiencing discrimination in relation to access and housing. So I think there's a range of different mechanisms that have been explored or currently being explored in relation to the Northern Ireland context. However, without an assembly and without any direction, we are frozen. So we have lots of kind of ideas in relation to going forward, but actually we're actually stuck at a very difficult juncture at this stage. Maybe. Marie,
do you want to speak to the ethos question if you?
Yes, I mean, I think the very straightforward answer to that is yes, because I think anything that increases the visibility of this problem and anything that brings consistency to the defining and measurement is good, because it means that there can be a stronger voice with regard to policy then. And I think one of the things, Karen has talked about our lamentable situation with regard to governance. But I actually think that on a positive note, what that has done is to shift public opinion in Northern Ireland. And I think we're seeing a more thoughtful public maybe around social issues. And we were quite surprised recently. We ran a series of questions in the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey on attitudes to poverty and social security. That's the first time we'd ever done that. And I have to say, I was a little bit nervous about it, because in many ways in the past, Northern Ireland Public's been shown to be quite conservative. And we were really surprised at the findings. Like about 80% of people said the government wasn't doing enough to address poverty and related issues. And 90% of people said that the government should make it possible for people to live a life of dignity. You know, and we'd ask questions about a whole range of social protection issues. So for me, that was quite promising, and you know, and it's an incentive for governments, and something that should give our political parties courage to move forward on some of these big issues, because on the social policy issues, there has been really, really limited progress in relation to the other devolved countries of the United Kingdom, you know, so we're lagging. And I think when the Assembly does come back, the public will expect more. And I think now housing and homelessness is to the front of their mind.
Thanks for that. That's some really interesting aspects. I think we're often struck down here as well how the political system is sometimes well behind the public on these issues, and then that's actually quite welcome. Not just welcome, but I think shows that we are going in the right direction. I am conscious of time, and that our participants have gone with us a little bit over. The only thing, just in terms of the compulsory purchase, in the Irish, in the Republic, one of the things we're seeing is very high levels of vacancy. So while compulsory orders, I mean, there's legal complexity to using compulsory orders, and I think there is a place for them. But I think actually, if government is better partnering with sort of owners of vacant properties and getting that back into use, I think that's actually the short-term win. And we, you know, that's an area that we really want to explore in the Simon community. So with that, I'm actually regretfully going to close, because I think there's a huge amount of fruitful conversation to be had with the research that you've done, the really excellent research you've done, and with Karen, your perspective from Northern Ireland, and how much symmetry there is. We sometimes tend to think of us being separate jurisdictions. We are, but and there are, you know, differences across the border, across the two borders, but there is a huge amount of commonality and similarity, and particularly the experience of homelessness. And the answers to homelessness are the same. So I think future collaboration is definitely on the cards, and will be welcome. So with that, I am going to close out. I'm going to thank all of our attendees for sticking with us for the extra couple of minutes, and thank Anne-Marie, John, and Karen for a really stimulating and interesting hour. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you, everybody. And just to say, you'll be getting an email about the future talks. I don't think we probably won't have one. We'll probably take a break for August, but the Simon talks will be back in September. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you.